So we're very happy to welcome Jon Burke, all the way from Hackney in London. Now, Jon Burke is the Cabinet Member for Energy, Waste, Transport and Public Realm at Hackney Council. He's a vociferous advocate and, more recently, in a very literal sense, defender of low traffic neighbourhoods in the borough. He's going to talk to us about how to deal with pushback and opposition to low traffic neighbourhoods. So over to you, Jon. Let's get your video and your microphone on. Brilliant.
Right then, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I
Yes,
just
we
got
can hear
one.
you.
I just got one. Yeah. So
I can hear you, Jon.
I think I heard someone from Liverpool. Is that no? Is that Chris?
Exactly. I'm just going to heckle.
Okay, so if we've got in case we've got any gate crashes in the room this evening, as you can see, I've come dressed as a UKIP councillor this evening to place everyone at ease in my favourite tweed jacket. It's lovely, in fact, to have people from the Wirral and from Hackney in the room this evening, and it was nice to hear someone talk fondly about cycling in Stoke Newington. But if there is anybody kind of in the room that is waiting to hear kind of my grand master plan for removing cars completely from the streets of Hackney and London, I'm afraid they're going to be disappointed. And I think that's kind of one of the myths that's been allowed to grow up around the more recent work on low traffic neighbourhoods, school streets and cycling infrastructure. You know, I've been very clear, and I wrote this recently in an article for Huffington Post on kind of the role that electric vehicles can play in the transport system in the future. You know, I think it's very clear that there will be a role for motor vehicles in industrial societies and in cities into the future. But, you know, I think that it's also equally clear that if we are to address the most pressing political issue, not just of our age, but of any age, you know, kind of rapid human-induced global warming, then we need to rapidly and deeply decarbonize every sector of the economy, and that includes land transport, which represents, you know, by most measures, 21% of all of the UK's emissions. And, you know, it's all the more pressing that we address land transport because, unlike some other sectors, such as the energy sector, which has been kind of rapidly decarbonised in recent years, land transport emissions have been growing very rapidly. Now, I'm sure Chris will touch on, or has in previous meetings touched on, you know, what that looks like in Manchester. But, you know, in 2019, you know, there were 330 million miles more driven on the roads of Manchester than 10 years previously, with all of the associated road danger, which is just a statistical fact from placing more cars on the road, air quality implications and global warming emissions associated with the operation of those vehicles. In London, the situation is even more grave, and the trajectory of the number of miles driven on our roads has been even faster and has been even kind of steeper. You know, since in 2019, there were 3.6 billion miles more driven on the streets of Greater London than in 2009. It took London something in the region of 100 years to get from 0 miles driven by motor vehicles to 20 billion. And then it took London another decade to increase that by 15.5%. And that is simply not sustainable and not compatible with the grave environmental crisis that we face and the social, economic and public health challenges presented by motor vehicles in the capital. And so, you know, part of the response to the potential for that to be exacerbated even further in a post-COVID world, in Hackney at least, and in other London boroughs and beyond, but in other London boroughs such as Islington, with Rowena Champion Adam Harrison in Camden, Claire Holland, who some of you will have heard of down in Lambeth, and of course the godfather of low traffic neighbourhoods, Clyde Lokes over in Waltham Forest. You know, all of those boroughs and more have been undertaking the delivery of low traffic neighbourhoods, but other measures such as school streets. Over the past year, I have delivered close to 40 school streets, which is the largest number in the UK and a key component in how we eliminate that quarter of the morning rush hour that Mary referred to earlier, which is clogging the roads and proving an impediment to blue badge holders, emergency service vehicles and commercial vehicles. You know, that is motor vehicles that are socially useful and really do need to be on the roads. But the crisis is not just a kind of general one in terms of the explosion in miles driven on London's roads. It's actually much more specific than that, because over that 10-year period, the increase in miles driven annually on London's roads has increased kind of 3.6 billion, but on London's residential roads, the increase is 3.9 billion miles. And you sort of think, well, how can that be the case? Someone's got the arithmetic wrong. And the reality is that the total net increase in miles driven on London's roads over a decade has been borne not only entirely by residential roads, but over that period, it's abstracted a further 300 million miles from the main road network. In fact, in London since 2006, the number of miles driven on the main road network has fallen by 800 million annually, whilst it's increased by 3.7 billion on residential roads. And, you know, there are multiple reasons for that. You know, the 10-year real terms cut in fuel duty has significantly reduced the marginal cost of operating a motor vehicle, and financing packages have made it easier for people on lower incomes to buy larger cars and more polluting cars that they might not perhaps have been able to afford previously. But I think for me, and I think of course online retail has played a role, though I'd be careful to kind of ascribe it all to online retail, because the growth in the number of miles driven by cars and private hire taxis over the last decade in London has risen at twice the rate of light commercial vehicles. But I think the main factor for me, and again Mary touched on this earlier, is that you know, Silicon Valley billionaires, through the creation of satellite navigation technology and the commodification of the knowledge of our residential streets, have turned all of our neighbourhoods in London and in Hackney into giant bypasses. Now, if I were to go to any constituency outside London and say to people in that town, would you like a giant bypass through the community? Of course, you know, they'd be up in arms about it and would overwhelmingly refuse it outright. You know, but we'd have to go through a protracted process of public consultation. There'd be legal challenges, and in many cases they'd be defeated. What has happened in London in particular, but in other cities too over the last 10 years, is that we've created bypasses through people's communities, and nobody has ever been consulted on that. When was the last time anybody in this room was consulted about the amount of miles driven on their roads? So it rings a little bit hollow, even though in Hackney we are undertaking an extensive consultation exercise around the new low traffic neighbourhoods. It rings a little hollow when people talk about consultation, because the things that we're seeking to retard, nobody consulted any member of the public on before. Nobody consulted all of those parents out there who are terrified to let their kids cycle to school because there are so many cars on the road, and then increasingly so many big cars. But anyway, I'm digressing slightly from the kind of specific point I'm here for, which is to talk about kind of, you know, how we're rolling out low traffic neighbourhoods and how we're dealing with some of the challenges of that. I think the first thing to note is that low traffic neighbourhoods are not a new concept in Hackney or you know, or more broadly across the UK. In fact, we delivered our first low traffic neighbourhood in 1974 in de Beauvoir, and it's one of the best places to cycle in the borough. And like most established low traffic neighbourhoods, if we suggested removing it, local residents would be absolutely up in arms about it. And the literature is clear time and time again that once the settling down period has come into effect, residents on the whole, just like with controlled parking zones, tend to realise the benefits. And if there is some slight disadvantage by adding a few minutes to their journeys here and there, I think for most residents, they realise that the trade-off is much quieter roads, safer roads, and pleasanter places in which to live. And we know from some of the work that Living Streets have undertaken, but work more broadly from TfL, that this doesn't just benefit local residents, it also benefits small businesses. And the more you can encourage people to remain within the locale and to travel within the locale, the more likely they are to avail themselves of those small businesses. And we know cyclists, public transport users and pedestrians spend more on average in their local town and district centres than people who drive do. So it's in the interest of the small business community, which will be struggling in a post-COVID world, to create the opportunities for increased footfall. And we've seen that in places like, Broadway Market, which we pedestrianised earlier this year. And we now have the unenviable task of being complained at every weekend about too many people being down there. Not that the businesses are not doing well enough. In the eyes of some, they're doing too well these days. So, they're not a new concept. We've had the first one since 1974. We delivered another bona fide one in the 80s in Brownswood. And Hackney, prior to COVID, had the largest number of modal filters, which most people in this room will be aware of what they are. In the UK, over 120 of them. And we had absolutely no problem with those 120 modal filters with the emergency services. We had no problem with any members of the public complaining they couldn't get where they wanted to go. And we had no residents complaining to us that they wanted those filters pulled out. So I think one of the driving forces behind some of the opposition to the most recent low traffic neighbourhoods is a natural aversion to kind of rapid social change. But that rapid social change, I would argue, is necessary because of the multiple crises we face, and is mandated in a borough like Hackney, where over 81% of voters in 2018 backed political parties that support low traffic neighbourhoods. And it's a borough where 70% of households don't own cars. Now, that doesn't mean to say that we ignore the needs of people who do need to use cars. But as I've made the point earlier, the more measures that we can undertake through, for example, low traffic neighbourhoods, school streets, improve cycling infrastructure, increase bus priority, such as the extension of bus lane hours of operation, the elimination of parking from bus lanes and the creation of bus gates. The more measures such as that we can put in place, the more unnecessary local car journeys we can eliminate, the more the more through traffic we can eliminate. And 45% of the cars on the streets of Hackney at any one time are passing through the borough without stopping. The more we can discourage that, the more space there will be for the vehicles that need to be there to use those roads. Now, I've seen Nick appear at the top of my screen, which tells me I've already rambled on for a good 10 minutes without touching the sides of what is a really interesting debate. But I'm very happy to take any questions that people have or continue for any remaining time I've got.
Yeah, thanks for that, John. So I think, you've got, let me just check, you've got about 7 or 8 minutes to answer questions, so we've got a little bit of time still. I think what's really important and cannot be stressed enough was you reeling off all those statistics. I think a lot of opponents to improving active travel see traffic as some kind of constant rather than something that's constantly increasing, and if we don't do something about it, if we don't give people alternatives, if we don't enable people to make journeys in a more sustainable and in a way that takes up less space, because that's ultimately what it comes down to. It's a question of physics, isn't it? The more big objects you have in a finite space, the harder it is for those things to move about. So I think it's absolutely essential to acknowledge that traffic isn't a constant law of nature. It's something that will just increase exponentially unless we do something about it. So that's my 2 pence. We've got some questions in here. Claire asks, have you converted any skeptical political allies? If so, what was the thing that helped you do that?
Well, I think it's kind of too early to tell. I think it's quite tricky because we've gone through COVID. We've been conducting group meetings, via kind of Google Hangouts or, you know, other mechanisms such as Zoom. And as a consequence, we've not been spending time at the town hall together. So there's not been opportunities, I think, to have those conversations with the unaligned that you might have done previously. So I don't think it's that easy to tell at this stage. I think that you know, as a group, we remain, you know, the group remains supportive of the policy position, and we've not had some of the problems that we've had elsewhere in London, such as Ealing in their group, and also I've been conducting, you know, since we developed the emergency transport plan. I took, you know, the ETP to group when it was approved. I then provided a deadline for written submissions to that, then a further drop-in with officers. We've had another drop-in with the head of service, and I've produced a weekly update for 3 months. I think on the whole, people who are not there to be convinced on this subject, you know, will only be convinced by the approbation of the public over time. So these schemes have got to kind of work on their own merits in order for people who kind of doubt them on principle to be convinced of their efficacy. And I think Mary kind of made the point earlier that, you know, one of the preoccupations for politicians, which seems perfectly rational, though perhaps I'm kind of a bit of an outlier in this respect, you know, is how things will play at the ballot box. And the overwhelming majority of politicians, though I think motivated by a desire to achieve things for their community, probably didn't put themselves forward to be, you know, abused, smeared, attacked, sent death threats on a kind of daily basis. And that's not for everyone. And in a functional democracy, it shouldn't be for everyone. But I do think there's a big element of councillors in London supporting improvements tacitly, but not necessarily being willing to put their heads above the parapet, because it's a pretty toxic atmosphere out there. You know, it's nice to be back in the north this evening, and I'm sure my detractors will be delighted too, because they never cease to spend any time telling me to go back to Liverpool because I don't belong in Hackney. And that's kind of been an element, I think, of some of the debate that even I found a bit shocking. The kind of London nativism that's come out of some of the opponents has been kind of has been a bit dispiriting, but that's the only part of it that really has been. I expected people to push back because this is a big change for people, and you know what we've had in terms of the operation of the road network is kind of unabated growth of vehicle usage. You know, a doubling of the number of cars on our roads in less than 30 years, and you know, nobody has said to drivers before, you can't go down there or do that thing that you really want to do on the whole. And so whilst I think a lot of the opposition is a response to rapid social change, I think it's also about the fact that fundamentally people know that this is an exercise in fair distribution of the road transport network. And as a socialist, I've got long-standing experience of the reaction of people who've got stuff to having that stuff taken away from them and given to other people. This is a redistributive process, and redistribution is painful for the people who've got stuff. But I think on the whole, it's beneficial for the people who haven't. And I think more people will benefit from low traffic neighbourhoods than will lose out.
Right. So a question it's already come up once this evening, but it's come up again. It'd be interesting to hear your experience on it. And that is this idea of displacement of traffic. I think it comes down again to this idea that, you know, traffic will stay the same in volume, but that means that the places that drivers can't go down because of the filters end up clogged up even more. What's your experience of that?
Okay, brilliant question, and I think it's a really important one. So I want to be very clear, right, that there is no mechanism through which residential roads displace traffic onto the main road network. Now, the main road network is built literally to carry through traffic, right, from one place to another, right. What has happened in London, as I noted earlier, is through the creation of satellite navigation technology and wayfinding apps, but also through the natural pressure of an overloaded main road network in the capital, as the number of cars have grown and the number of miles driven have grown, is displacement into our neighbourhoods. The amount of miles driven annually on the main roads of London have fallen by 800 million in 14 years, and they've increased by 3.7 billion on our residential roads. Residential roads do not displace traffic onto the main road network. Main roads displace traffic onto the residential road network. And what we experience when local authorities say enough is enough, we are no longer going to allow Silicon Valley billionaires to commodify our roads for the benefit of individual drivers and for the chief executive and the non-executive directors of Google, right, is that you see some of the cars that should have otherwise always been on the main road network, on that main road network. Now, I'm not saying to the people who live along the main road network that that's kind of, you know, tough cheese and they've just kind of suck it up. But and I've been very clear about this, the only way you will address, okay, let me dial back a sec. There's two main ways in which you can address that overloaded main road network, right? One is to open up all elements of every neighbourhood and allow that extensive displacement that we've experienced to happen. Now, we tried that and it failed miserably. It didn't solve air pollution. It didn't solve congestion. It didn't solve road safety problems. And in the fullness of time, as people will know in this room, the law of induced demand means that not only will all the main roads fill up, all the residential roads will fill up too. And so by opening up our neighbourhoods to cars, to the unabated access of cars, all we do is kick the can down the road to the point at which we decide, actually, we do need some policies to address this, some demand side policies, or we need some double decker roads. Now, I joked recently that people who are, you know, very fanatical about car usage would advocate double decker roads before they advocated demand side measures to address the excessive number of cars on the road. And then I saw the plans for the Hammersmith Bridge, which does involve a double-decker road, much to my absolute horror. You know, but the other alternative, if we're not going to go down that route, is demand-side policy. Low-traffic neighbourhoods represent one element of that. They're there to protect our communities from through traffic, and we also then need very specific targeted demand-side policies for the main road network. Now, a lot of drivers don't want to hear the fact that you know, there's a limited supply of road space, and if they want to access it in a way that allows them to get from A to B relatively quickly when they use the roads, that we're going to need to ration that road space either through a price signal, through road user pricing, or through giving people an allocation of miles they can drive on the main road network every year. I suspect in the market society in which we live, people will be more likely to opt for road user pricing, and this was recommended by the London Assembly's Transport Committee through its excellent report, London Stalling. You'll see the pun there. They're often pun-based titles for these reports. So, you know, back in 2017, it was clear that the fundamental cause of congestion on London's roads is an excessive number of miles being driven on them. And we know it's not low traffic neighbourhoods because the average bus speed in London has been falling for a decade, long before many of the new low traffic neighbourhoods, which even now only represent a tiny minority of the local road transport network in London, ever arrived. So, you know, in my view, the answer is clear. Whilst we do need good cycling infrastructure and, you know, the kind of cycle lessons that are kind of, you know, converting people locally in Hackney, we do need good storage. We do need things like the Delft cycle plan to get us where we need to be. There is no route to reducing the volume of vehicles on our roads and the amount of miles that are driving that does not involve demand-side measures to retard the use of those vehicles. And so we need low traffic neighbourhoods for the neighbourhoods, and we need road user pricing or some similar mechanism to ration demand for you know, an overloaded main road network. Now, people might say, oh, we don't like the idea of that, but it wasn't local authorities that presided over the doubling of cars on our roads in less than 3 decades, and it wasn't local authorities that froze fuel duty for a decade, which effectively represents a big cut in the cost of operating a motor vehicle. But it is local authorities and councillors like me who are full council, have members of the public come to them, deputations, and they say, my children are not safe on the streets of this borough right? My children are not safe in their yards when they're breathing in particulate matter from the cars that you're allowing to dominate our roads, right? And my children's future is not safe from the absolutely exponential rise in land transport emissions that have been allowed to occur in this country. What are you, Councillor Burke, going to do about it? No one goes to Grant Shapps and says that. Grant Shapps is all right taking a few soft-soap questions in the Commons, but he hasn't got to look in the eyes of a mother and tell them they're going to do something about the fact that the roads aren't safe enough for their children. So councillors didn't create this problem, but we've been left with the unenviable task of addressing it. And that's made us a lot of enemies, and it's made me in particular probably a disproportionate amount of enemies for a variety of reasons, one of which I'm working class and therefore I'm not supposed to ride a bike. Car drivers keep telling me. The other reason is I can't be bullied, and I've come armed with the facts to the arguments that I make. And as a result, I'm told there are whole Facebook forums, which fortunately I'm not on, dedicated to kind of studying the minutiae of my Twitter posts, but I'm not going to be cowed, in whatever occupation I'm in, whether I'm a councillor or whatever I do in the future, by a group of people who've come together to retain the status quo for their own individual benefit. We're going to have to learn to get along in a world of fewer cars that benefit society more generally rather than a small number of individuals. But that isn't a car-free world. They still represent an important part of the transport mix.
Great. Okay, John, I'm afraid we could listen to you all night, but we do have limited time. Thank you very much for that. If you look in the chat, people are asking how we give a standing ovation on Zoom. I think you've made a great impression here. So thanks again for joining us.
Happy to come back at some point if you can bear me.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I think we'd enjoy that. So